Yeah. Yeah, we've had to cancel a couple of the video shoots we're going to do for fishing shows because of the virus.
Yeah.
It's hard to social distance on a 16-foot skiff with a couple fishermen and a camera crew.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is a good alternative.
Yes, it sure is. It sure is. Yeah, we just got 2.5 minutes left to go here and we'll get started.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. I'm going to refill my evening beverage. I'll be right back.
Sounds good. For all of those of you patiently waiting, we're going to start in 2 minutes, okay?
So Dave, do you do much fishing, sight fishing for carp up there?
I have not really done much fishing for carp. Most of that's done up in Grand Traverse Bay, and I really haven't gotten up there to do it yet.
It's a lot of fun.
Is it?
Yeah, it's like freshwater, cross between freshwater redfish and bonefish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend that guides for him up there, and a lot of his summer guiding is out on Grand Traverse for water's real clear. And
yeah, those zebra mussels are clearing up the water.
You can see, I live right on the shore of Lake Michigan, and I can go out 40 feet and see the bottom and count the grains of sand.
Wow. That's hurting. That's put a hurting on some of the native populations like the perch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, what a mess.
Yeah, it's mess, and they get all over your boat, and it's just crazy.
Do they have regulations on where you can trail your boat so you don't introduce them to other lakes?
They just expect you to clean your boat,
Gotcha.
which I really don't know how many people are really careful about, but
yeah, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, I guess the good thing is we don't have them down here.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think they can survive in salt water. It might be a new research project for you. I hope not.
We've got enough problems. Thank you very much.
They're nasty. Well, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another one of Fly Fisher International's online Zooms. My name is Dave Peterson, and I'm Conservation Chair of FFI. Tonight's webinar is first in the series of conservation webinars. We plan to host these meetings with conservation leaders across the country to illustrate the challenges that our fisheries face and the possible solutions to those challenges. First, a little housekeeping. Those of you watching can click on the chat button you'll see at the bottom of your screen and submit questions to us. We'll be able to see them, and we'll respond to your questions later in the webinar at an appropriate time. Tonight, we're pleased to have as our guest Dr. Aaron Adams. He's Director of Science and Conservation for the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, one of our conservation partners, and he's a senior scientist with the Harbor Branch Institute at Florida Atlantic University. Welcome, Dr. Adams. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
We're really looking forward to this tonight, and I think we might as well jump into tonight's topic. Can you tell us about Bonefish and Tarpon Trust and its mission, and what are your major areas of research?
Sure. Our BTT's mission is to basically take a science-based approach to inform education, advocacy, geared towards conserving and restoring bonefish, tarpon, permit, and most importantly, their habitats. I say science-based, that's a pretty important aspect of what we do. We focus on figuring out what makes the species tick, when, where, how they move, the habitats they depend on, the impacts, the threats like habitat loss, water quality declines. And we try and put all that into the public domain to influence conservation and management. And we take a really broad conservation and research approach. So we either conduct or fund research that spans everything from economics to tracking fish to oceanography, genetics, mapping, more recently see some sociological work, because we think it's important to have a big picture view as well as the smaller details, of course, to give us the leverage that we need to actually get management, resource management agencies to change how they manage the fisheries.
Interesting. How did it get started?
Bonefish Tarpon Trust started in 1998. A group of fishermen and fishing guides in the Florida Keys noticed a decline in bonefish and tarpon numbers in the 90s and got together. Basically, they wanted to be trout unlimited for the flats. And so they called themselves Bonefish Tarpon Unlimited initially. But they quickly found out that there was very little known about bonefish tarpon and permit. And so instead of being an advocacy group as they expected, they became a science-based conservation group. And so what we do is on a regular basis, we'll assess the status of knowledge for bonefish tarpon and permit, assess the threats, which of course will differ by location, and then use that information to prioritize the type of research that we'll do. And then the research that we do is specifically geared to address conservation or management issues. So for example, we realized in recent years that there were some potential problems with the permit population in the Florida Keys. And so we funded some research to track the permit to see how far they moved, what habitats they prefer, those types of things. And with that research, we figured out that the majority of permit from the flats in the Florida Keys went to one or two locations in the Florida Keys, the biggest one being Western Dry Rocks. And so we actually use that information already to expand the spawning season closure. Not everyone releases permit. There is a harvest fishery. So that's now, 4 months? And now we're pushing to actually get that area totally closed to fishing during the spawning months. So it's very much grown from a group of concerned anglers and guides to, like I said, a science-based, pretty hard-hitting organization that puts science into the whole mix.
Really neat. Yeah, we sent in a comment on the Western Dry Rocks regulations changes. So when will you find out what happens with that closing?
Well, what most recently happened is that the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission wrote a letter to the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, which was proposing some closures of Western Dry Rocks, and opposed those closures, stating that the management of habitats, et cetera, in the sanctuary was fine by the sanctuary, but that FWC, Fish and Wildlife Commission for Florida, managed the fisheries. So they said it was their responsibility to deal with any fishery closure. So now it goes from the federal comments to the state, FWC. And over the next few months, we expect that process to play itself out. So on our website, we have a direct link where people can send a note of concerns directly to FWC about the need to make Western Dry Rocks a spawning season closure. And I know that you guys sent your letter to the sanctuary, Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, as well as the FWC, which is important. But now it looks like FWC will put that on their shoulders, and we're pushing hard to get that closure in place.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah. I mean, in general, fishing fish that are spawning is not a great idea. And with permit, our research found that well over 30% of permit that were hooked at spawning sites were eaten by sharks before they could get landed, which is way too high of a number. So even if people were catch and release fishing, they were essentially harvesting a large portion of the fish, which it wasn't good for the rest of the fishery. So yeah, we think a spawning season closure is important.
Okay, great. We were looking at your work before in preparation for this, and we're particularly interested in what you've discovered about the spawning habitats of bonefish as well. Can you share a little bit about what you've learned and how those findings inform conservation of bonefish?
Sure. Similar to the Western dry rocks issue with permit, one of the things that we do, I already said we take a kind of broad approach, is we want to be able to identify the habitats that bonefish tarpon and permit depend on to be successful. And so we first started doing a lot of tagging of bonefish to figure out their general movements. And after some years of that, we figured out what their home ranges were. And it's pretty small. Most of the fish that we tagged that were recaptured within a mile of where they were originally tagged. Right? So that means that if you go to a particular flat to fish for bonefish, and you go back, say, 5 days in a row, you're probably fishing for the same fish. That's their home flat. That's why areas that get fished pretty heavily, the fish can get pretty smart. They're still there, but they're not going to eat your fly. So the next step then was to figure out, okay, we know they don't spawn on the flats because we've never seen it, others have never seen it. And so we started tracking fish with what are called acoustic telemetry tags to actually follow the fish. And in 2011, colleagues that we were funding finally figured out that bonefish will travel some pretty long distances from the flats. And they'll go to the bays that are, say, 5 to 15 feet deep. Not on the flats, obviously. Gather in large schools. We've seen schools of pre-spawning bonefish in these bays of 10,000 fish. And they figured this out in 2011. And in the years since, we've identified 10 of these pre-spawning sites. And then more recently, over the past 5 years or so, we've been trying to figure out what happens. Where do they actually spawn? We know they go offshore, but that's all we've known for years. So in November of last year, 2019, we were finally able to get a complete track of fish when they went to spawn. So they were in these large pre-spawning aggregations or groups. About, at this particular school, I think it was 6,000 to 7,000 fish. And at dusk, they moved offshore, and they kind of meandered around in offshore waters for a few hours. And when I say offshore, I mean water that's thousands of feet deep. The kind of places where you troll for mahi or tuna or wahoo. And after a few hours, they descended from the surface pretty quickly. And we recorded them with our tags. We were able to kind of track. The tags have depth sensors on them. And the fish went all the way down to 450 feet deep, which is pretty insane considering they live 99% of their lives in less than 3 feet of water.
Yeah.
And they spent a few hours below 300 feet, kind of meandering around. And then finally, just before dawn, they rushed back towards the surface, and they stopped at 250 feet of depth. And that's where they spawned. And then they headed back into the shallows and went home. So that was a pretty amazing discovery, that fish would migrate, 70 miles from their home flat and then go offshore, probably chased by marlins and sailfish and swordfish and all kinds of stuff, and to spawn. It was pretty amazing finding. Now that we've got that information, we're using it to identify other sites. I think we've identified 10 spawning locations now in the Bahamas and Belize and Cuba. And we're using that information to try and find out where they get together to spawn in the Florida Keys. Amazingly, we don't know that yet in the Florida Keys. Nobody's seen it. We're zoning in on some spots. I think this coming season, they spawn between October and April around the full moons. I think we'll find out where they spawn in the Florida Keys. And then the whole goal of all this information is not just to see some really cool stuff, but is to get these areas protected so the habitats aren't degraded and people don't fish for them while they're spawning.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I should also note before moving on that if people want to see some footage of this spawning activity, they can go to our Vimeo page, vimeo.com/Bonefish Tarpon Trust. And we just uploaded a video that includes the tracking of spawning fish as well as some other aspects of some research. And they'll be able to see some drone footage and also some underwater footage of these spawning schools.
Just, I mean, briefly, what does it entail to do this kind of research other than the tagging? I mean, are you following these guys around in boats and to get these videos? And
it requires a considerable loss of sleep. Our mantra is sleep is for sissies and you can sleep when you're dead. The tracks, in that track I talked about from November, I think that track was 18 hours. When we're working with them inshore, we're on flats boats. When we're following offshore, we're typically on larger boats, say 26 feet or so, because it can get rough seas. We encounter tiger sharks and others out there, so we don't want to be, in a vessel that's going to cause some issues for us if it gets rough. It's just a lot of time and effort. From a fishing perspective, think about it, if you're a freshwater angler, think about it as blue lining, right? If they can look at all those maps or nowadays Google Earth, figuring out places you think might be good to fish where you won't find people, taking the drive, taking the long hike. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. Same way that those of us in the Salt check out some backcountry areas. Just a lot of time invested, and eventually you hit pay dirt. It's also about taking a pretty specific stepwise approach, revising how we look at it from what we've learned in the past. Just like any good angler, right? You learn the right flies by experience.
Yeah, very interesting. What are the critical things that need to be done to protect bonefish habitat and tarpon habitat and permit habitat?
Yeah, habitat is the key word. You said it many times. Our tagline for Bonefish Tarpon Trust is healthy habitat equals healthy fisheries. And so we're constantly working to counteract losses and degradation of habitat due to coastal development. In Florida, probably our biggest issue now is declining water quality. I'm sure everyone's heard about the harmful algal blooms, the algae blooms that we've had, which we call out fish kills. So the critical things that need to be done are to get the policymakers to change how we do business. We can't allow polluted waters to flow into our coastal areas anymore. We have to not only stop the loss of habitats to development, we have to put a lot of effort into habitat restoration, which is expensive, but it's necessary. I say expensive, but in the big picture, it's not. The recreational saltwater fishery in Florida has an annual economic impact of around $8 billion a year. Just the flats fishing in the Florida Keys is about $460 million a year. So if we spend $5-6 million on habitat restoration every year, I think that's a pretty good investment. In places like Belize, coastal development's becoming more and more of a problem. The Bahamas, some of those similar issues. So it's all about getting the habitats identified and protected. That's our main goal.
I had a question here come up from one of our participants. It was back when we were talking about bonefish. The question is from Mark Rockwell in California. Do bonefish move often between Florida and the Bahamas? It seems like the large bones are still in the Bahamas, but not in the Florida area. Do you know why they disappeared?
So we've done a lot of tagging. In the Bahamas, I think we've tagged around 14,000 fish. We do not see movements between islands, much less between Florida Keys and Bahamas. A couple instances, likely instances or potential instances of fish that were tagged in the Keys and recaptured on Andros happened maybe 12 years ago. But if those were actually real, and we're not convinced they were, that's extremely rare. So the way that the populations are connected is when bonefish go offshore to spawn, like I described, they do what's called broadcast spawning. Males, females together in thousands, and they eject the eggs and sperm into the open water. And fertilization is external. It's not like a trout or a bass with a nest or anything. The eggs hatch in about 24 hours. The larvae that hatch from them don't look anything like a bonefish, and they float around in the open ocean for between 40 and 70 days. And what the ocean currents can transport those larvae in gyres or eddies right back to the same island where they were spawned, or they might transport them long distances. And the research we've done on oceanographic currents and genetics show that a good number of the bonefish that are in the Florida Keys were actually spawned in places like Southwest Cuba, Mexico, and Belize. So the decline of bonefish in the 90s into the 2000s in the Keys was probably due to a few things. One, there are some places in Cuba, Mexico, where there's been a high harvest of bonefish. So we may have lost some spawners. That trend has been reversed. And then the Florida Keys, we had a lot of water quality issues. So we think that what happened in the Keys is that we weren't getting many young bonefish coming in. Those larvae weren't coming in from overseas and then becoming juveniles and adults. At the same time, we were losing some of the good habitats in the Keys. So that's why we don't have those really large bonefish in the Keys at the moment. However, starting maybe 4 years ago, we started to see some young bonefish. So we're seeing some better numbers in the Keys now. And we think those are larvae that came from other locations as they improve their management strategies. The Bahamas most of the Bahamas Islands, not all, have not had the extreme habitat degradation or harvest issues. The habitat degradation like in the Keys, the harvest issues like say in Southwest Cuba. And so there are islands where you still have large bonefish. But here's something I bet you didn't know, is that a bonefish in the Keys probably grows 2 to 3 times faster than it does in the Bahamas. So a 23-inch, this is to the fork of the tail, 23-inch bonefish in the Florida Keys is about 6 years old, 7 maybe. In the Bahamas, around the Caribbean, that fish is about 16 years old. So if you go to the Bahamas and you catch a 10-pound bonefish, which is probably around 29, 30 inches, there's a good chance that fish is 28 plus years old.
Wow.
So it takes a while for the fish. So I would expect in the Keys, as these new fish, if they continue to keep coming in, give it some years and we'll start seeing some larger fish again in the Keys.
Okay. Got another question for you. How much does the red tide affect the water quality and fish? And do you expect the red tide to continue, or is that an impossible thing to predict?
Well, the short answer is yes, red tide will occur again. The organism that causes red tide, Karenia brevis, is natural in the Gulf of Mexico. It occurs, they have red tide blooms in the northern Gulf and also in Southwest Florida, most commonly. But the intensity, frequency, duration, and the spatial coverage of red tide in Florida has expanded over the years. And the research shows that that's due to too many nutrients that we're putting into coastal waters. So remember, I'd already talked about how water quality being an issue in Florida. That's a big one. Red tide is usually on the west coast, southwest coast of Florida. But 2 years ago, when it was particularly bad, it was caught up in some of the currents and ended up in the Florida Keys and all the way around on the east central coast of Florida. Areas around Central Florida, like St. Lucie area, had some pretty bad red tides and fish kills. So red tide, again, it occurs naturally, but we're making it worse with our pollution. So the faster we get rid of that nutrient pollution, the less frequent and intense red tides will be. But I would expect them, to continue. We'll continue to see them, unfortunately.
As you look to the future, are you optimistic about the preservation of bonefish, tarpon, and permit, or are you pessimistic?
Good question. I'm a fly fisherman, so I'm an optimist. Anybody who as a friend of mine says, ties a bunch of crap on a hook and expects it to catch fish has to be an optimist. And I'm also a conservation biologist, so I'm an optimist there as well. So I think we can. It's going to take everyone participating to give bonefish, tarpon, hermit, snook, any of the other flat fish, a good future. And it's not always sexy. It means supporting groups like Bonefish Tarpon Trust and others that use that science-based approach to push for education, advocacy, and policy change. But it also takes things like, and it's not sexy or fun, but letters to your politicians. If you live in Florida or the Bahamas or Belize or anywhere else or flats fishing, you need to let your representatives, your politicians know that this is extremely important, not just as a livelihood, but economically. If you don't live in those areas, but you do go to fish, or it's on your bucket list to fish, you should be writing letters. The governor of Florida, for example, should be getting letters from people in, say, Michigan, where you are, Dave, who go to Florida to fish, and let the governor know that you're not going to go to Florida and spend your money unless Florida gets its act together with improving water quality. Same can be said for Bahamas, Belize, Cuba, anywhere else if there's a flats fishery. Just from an economic perspective, we contribute billions of dollars a year to coastal economies. And so they're important in that respect, but also many others. So that's how people can get involved. They need to get educated, be the squeaky wheel, and also I should not forget, be responsible when they're on the water. Practice good catch and release. The BTT webpage has a lot of information on how to be responsible for catch and release. Only fish with guides and lodges that practice good catch and release. And then when you're on the water, if you're on your own on the water, on a boat or otherwise, be ethical. Don't run other people over. Don't run the flats. Those types of things. So our own behavior plus getting better policy are ways that we can get involved to make it work.
This is kind of a related question from Christopher Vincent up in Minnesota. Is BTT working with Captains for Clean Water in collaboration, or is each doing their own thing?
We are. We interact with those guys frequently. They are very good advocates in Tallahassee. They have which is our state capital. They have a lot of good connections. We're up there a good bit as well. We interact regularly in the various venues, different meetings, that type of thing. Yeah, we do work with them, working towards the same ends for sure, as well as other groups, Everglades Foundation, Bull Sugar, et cetera. There's a number of groups down here that are pushing hard to move the needle.
We're back to a scientific question here from a fellow scientist from University of Oregon, Phil Parker. Are the differences between bonefish from different regions, Florida, Cuba, for example, due to environmental factors, or are they different species, subspecies?
Great question. So bonefish, it's just like fishing for them. One day you think you got them figured out, and the next they just flip you the fin. So you can't tell the species of bonefish apart by looking at them for the most part. So some geneticists in, I want to say mid-2000s, did some work on the genetics, and they figured out that there's a dozen or so species worldwide. In this area, we have 4 species that we, again, have to use genetics to figure it out. We can't tell by looking. But 98, 99% of the fish that are in the flats fishery are one species, Abula vulpes. So the differences that we see in the growth rates aren't due to species differences. We regularly now sample, take genetic samples, fin clips, and do the analysis to make sure we're on the right species. It could be environmental is our best guess. A couple possibilities. One is that the Florida Keys is subtropical, it's not tropical. And so it actually has what you might call I'm laughing because I live in Florida, a winter. It's not a Michigan winter, Dave. It is our winter. So the waters cool down. And so since bonefish are cold-blooded, one theory is that they have less that they have to eat during the winter months in order to maintain their metabolism. They basically slow down. And so anything they do eat goes into growth. Whereas if fish live in the tropics like Belize, Cuba, they have to eat a lot just to keep up with their higher metabolism because the water's warmer. Another possibility is that the Florida Keys is dominated by seagrass beds, turtle grass mostly, which is very rich in prey, a lot of different prey species. A lot of the Caribbean is more sand flats, maybe some algal bottoms, so it might be a different prey base as well. And then the third possibility is, as I said, the spawning season runs from October through April. And what we're finding is that different islands, say in the Bahamas, there might be bonefish spawning every month, but every location seems to have a particular peak spawning month. It might be that bonefish in warmer locations spawn for more months, and it takes a lot of energy to make eggs and to migrate to spawn, so they might be putting a lot of energy into that. We think that's happening with permit. For example, in Florida, permit basically spawn during the summer, maybe March through July, August. If you get down as far as Belize, they spawn 10 months out of the year. So they put a lot more energy into spawning, and so probably slower growth rates. That's something that's on the list to figure out for sure. But it's good we know that, because that tells us then that even though you're not going to see what they used to find in Florida a lot, 10, 11, 12 pound bonefish, you'll see some of that in the Caribbean, but not a lot. But that doesn't mean that the fish aren't getting just as old, they're just growing slower.
Well, here's another bonefish question. Everybody likes to fish for bonefish. Sean Phelps has this question. I've gone bone fishing in the Keys, the Bahamas, and most recently on the Honduran islands of Roatan and Guyana. I'm not sure I'm saying that properly. Bonefish in Guyana tend to be larger and more numerous. Do you have any information or opinion on the bonefish populations in these habitats?
Well, the latter location has more seagrass, so that might explain part of it as far as maybe they grow faster. But also a lot of what we see now is a reflection of what's happened in the past. So a lack of large fish, and again, if a large fish is 20 some years old, the lack of large fish now may be due to things like netting or other types of harvest 15, 20 years ago. As an example, in the Ascension Bay area in Mexico, if you fished there, say 15, 20 years ago, you could catch bonefish, but they were all small, little hot dogs, maybe 12 inches. About 15 years ago, as part of implementing the Sian Khan Biosphere Reserve in that area, they basically bought out the net fishermen. And so there's no more gill netting that occurs in Ascension Bay. So you can now go and catch 6 pound bonefish in Ascension Bay, 7 pound bonefish. And if you remember earlier, I said that in the Caribbean, a 23-inch bonefish, which is probably about 5 pounds, is going to be 16 years old. Right there, probably puts that connection back to that harvest that occurred until 15 years ago. So it's probably a mix of those factors. But my guess is that next time you go down to Honduras, go to a local bar and start asking around some of the locals, and I bet you'll find that there was some netting there in Roatan more recently than there was elsewhere.
Interesting. One final question, Dr. Adams, and then we're going to close this out. We're getting up to a half hour. This is from Mark Rockwell in California. Do you see any problems with the numbers of tarpon coming into the Keys in spring? Do you track where they come from and where they spawn in summer?
Yeah, we do. We have been putting telemetry tags in tarpon now for 4 years. I think we have, I want to say, about 150 tags. They're 5-year tags. We've been tracking some fish for all those 5 years. So we have a good idea where they go, where they migrate during the summers. We have a good idea of their migratory patterns coming in the spring, where they hang out. The numbers, of course, vary every year. Some years they seem to be more abundant in the Keys and less abundant in Southwest Florida, like Boca Grande, and other years it's the opposite. These fish live up to 80 years. They have pretty complex behaviors. So year to year changes, we're not too concerned about it, so it's longer term trends. Last year in the Keys was pretty good. Last year in Southwest Florida was excellent. So far this year, we're hearing about good numbers of fish. Water quality last year and this year were both very good. 2 years ago, with the red tides and the other algae blooms, it wasn't. And the fishery up in northern Florida and Georgia was actually better than it had been for some time. So we think some of the fish from South Florida moved up there to get away from all the nasty water. So yeah, I mean, tarpon, it's not like it was, 20, 30 years ago, but we're making progress on figuring them out and improving regulations. For sure.
Great. We got one more question for you, and then we are going to wrap it up. Is there any reading material? This is from Ed Gomez. Is there any reading material you would recommend to someone who would like to learn more about bonefish?
Yeah, I would say the best book right now is Fly Fishing for Bonefish by Chico Fernandez. Chico spent his entire fly fishing life focusing on bonefish. He loves a lot of species, but the guy can catch bonefish. It's kind of, the book's not that old, but the information on the bonefish biology is already a little bit outdated. I wrote a few chapters to start the book about bonefish biology. So I'd say Chico's book is probably number one. Just go to Amazon and search Chico Fernandez Bonefish and you'll see it. It's a great book.
Thanks so much. Listen, I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight, and I want to especially thank you for your valuable time. We've all learned a great deal about marine fisheries in a short period of time, and we're really grateful for the research that you're doing and the work that BTT is doing a lot to save fish in marine environments. And
thanks.
We appreciate it.
Cuts into my fishing time.
Yeah, I bet it does. I bet it does. I hope our audience will spread the word about our conservation conversations and help FFI protect all fish in all waters. Please join us for our next webinar on Thursday, May 21st at the same time. You'll meet Spencer Shaver and learn about his battle with the Sportsmen for the Boundary Waters to save the Boundary Waters wilderness from open pit copper mining, which is an incredible threat to an incredible wilderness. So hope everyone stays safe, and thanks again for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Adams.
Thanks for the time.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.